In the sweltering summer of 1943, deep within the Soviet Union, two of Germany's most brilliant military minds stood at the precipice of what would become the largest tank battle in human history. General Hermann Hoth, commander of the 4th Panzer Army, had just received intelligence that would make him laugh with contempt. Across the battlefield, General Nikolai Vatutin commanded the Voronezh front, and Hoth considered him nothing more than another weak Soviet general who would crumble under the unstoppable might of German steel. What Hoth couldn't have imagined was that his arrogance would lead to the complete annihilation of his most elite divisions in a battle so brutal, so devastating, that it would forever change the course of World War II. The relationship between these two commanders had been building toward this moment for months. Hermann Hoth was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who had carved through Soviet defenses like a hot knife through butter during the early days of Operation Barbarossa. His 4th Panzer Army had been instrumental in the devastating German advances of 1941 and 1942, and by the summer of 1943, Hoth had developed an almost pathological contempt for Soviet military leadership. In his private correspondence with other German commanders, he frequently referred to Soviet generals as incompetent peasants who relied on numbers rather than tactical brilliance. When intelligence reports reached him about Nikolai Vatutin's appointment to command the Voronezh front, Hoth's response was characteristic of his arrogance. He told his staff officers that Vatutin was just another weak Soviet general who would break the moment German panzers appeared on the horizon. Nikolai Vatutin, however, was far from the weak commander that Hoth imagined him to be. Born into a peasant family in Ukraine, Vatutin had risen through the ranks of the Red Army through sheer brilliance and determination. Unlike many Soviet commanders who had survived Stalin's purges through political maneuvering, Vatutin had earned his position through tactical genius and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate enemy movements. By 1943, he had already proven himself in multiple campaigns, but the upcoming battle at Kursk would be his greatest test. What made Vatutin particularly dangerous was his intimate knowledge of the terrain around Kursk and his ability to think like his German opponents. While Hoth was preparing for what he believed would be another easy victory against inferior Soviet forces, Vatutin was meticulously planning the destruction of the German war machine. The stage for this confrontation was set with Operation Citadel, Hitler's ambitious plan to eliminate the Soviet salient around Kursk. The German High Command had convinced themselves that this operation would be the decisive blow that would finally break Soviet resistance and secure German victory in the East. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army was assigned to attack from the south, while Model's 9th Army would attack from the north, creating a massive pincer movement that would trap hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. The plan looked brilliant on paper, and Hoth was supremely confident that his forces, equipped with the newest German tanks including the fearsome Tiger and Panther tanks, would easily smash through Soviet defenses and link up with Model's forces within days. What the Germans didn't realize was that the Soviets had been preparing for this offensive for months. Soviet intelligence had penetrated German planning at the highest levels, and Stalin himself had been briefed on the details of Operation Citadel weeks before it began. Vatutin had used this intelligence to create the most sophisticated defensive system ever constructed in military history. The Kursk salient had been transformed into a fortress of unimaginable proportions, with multiple defensive lines stretching back over 100 kilometers. Each line contained thousands of anti-tank guns, carefully concealed artillery positions, and extensive minefields that would channel attacking German forces into predetermined killing zones. Vatutin had personally supervised the construction of these defenses, often spending entire nights in forward positions to ensure that every detail was perfect. The German offensive began on July 5, 1943, with a massive artillery barrage that lasted for hours. Hoth was confident that this bombardment would shatter Soviet morale and clear the way for his panzers to achieve a rapid breakthrough. As his tanks began their advance, Hoth radioed his division commanders with characteristic arrogance, telling them that they were about to witness the collapse of another weak Soviet defense. The initial German advance seemed to confirm Hoth's expectations, as his forces pushed forward several kilometers against what appeared to be light Soviet resistance. Hoth began planning his victory celebration, certain that Vatutin's forces were already beginning to crumble. But Vatutin had anticipated exactly this kind of German confidence. The initial Soviet withdrawal was a carefully planned tactical maneuver designed to draw German forces deeper into the defensive system. As Hoth's panzers advanced, they were unknowingly moving into a carefully prepared trap. Soviet observers, hidden in camouflage positions throughout the battlefield, were reporting every German movement back to Vatutin's headquarters. The Soviet commander watched the German advance with the patience of a master chess player waiting for the perfect moment to spring his trap. Every German tank that entered the salient was being tracked, every German formation was being monitored, and every German weakness was being noted for future exploitation. On the second day of the offensive, Hoth's confidence began to waver. His advance had slowed considerably as German forces encountered increasingly fierce Soviet resistance. The Red Army troops that Hoth had expected to flee in panic were instead fighting with desperate courage, turning every village, every hill, and every farm into a fortress. German casualties were mounting at an alarming rate, and several of Hoth's most experienced commanders were reporting that Soviet resistance was far stronger than intelligence had predicted. But Hoth's arrogance prevented him from recognizing the true nature of his situation. Instead of reassessing his strategy, he simply ordered his forces to attack with greater aggression, convinced that one more push would shatter what he still believed was weak Soviet morale. Vatutin, meanwhile, was carefully managing his resources like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of destruction. He had positioned his strongest forces not in the forward defensive lines, where the Germans expected them, but in carefully concealed reserve positions where they could strike at the most opportune moment. The Soviet commander had studied German tactical doctrine extensively and understood that German commanders like Hoth were prone to overconfidence and tactical inflexibility. Vatutin's plan was to allow the Germans to exhaust themselves against his defensive lines, then launch a devastating counterattack that would destroy German offensive capability once and for all. By July 8th, Hoth's forces had advanced only 15 kilometers into the Soviet defensive system, far short of their objectives. German casualties were reaching catastrophic levels, with some divisions reporting losses of over 50% of their men and equipment. The vaunted German panzer divisions that had terrorized Europe were being systematically destroyed by Soviet anti-tank guns, mines, and artillery. Hoth's own headquarters had been forced to relocate twice as Soviet artillery began targeting German command positions with devastating accuracy. Yet even as his forces were being pulverized, Hoth continued to insist that Soviet resistance was on the verge of collapse. His staff officers began to question their commander's judgment, but Hoth's arrogance prevented him from acknowledging the reality of his situation. The turning point came on July 12th at the small village of Prokhorovka, where Hoth's forces encountered the full might of Vatutin's armored reserves. The Soviet commander had been waiting for this moment when German forces would be at their most vulnerable, exhausted from days of brutal fighting and low on ammunition and fuel. As Hoth's remaining panzers approached Prokhorovka, they were met by the largest concentration of Soviet tanks ever assembled in a single battle. Over 800 Soviet tanks, supported by massive artillery concentrations and air support, crashed into the German formations like a steel avalanche. The battle that followed was unlike anything that had ever been witnessed in military history. The sound of clashing armor could be heard for miles as hundreds of tanks engaged in close-quarters combat across the rolling hills around Prokhorovka. The air was thick with smoke and the screams of dying men as tank crews on both sides fought with desperate ferocity. But the outcome was never really in doubt. Hoth's forces, weakened by days of brutal fighting and operating at the end of extended supply lines, were no match for Vatutin's fresh armored reserves. Soviet T-34 tanks, supported by the new KV-1 heavy tanks, systematically destroyed German formations that had once seemed invincible. As the battle raged, Hoth finally began to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. The weak Soviet general he had mocked was systematically destroying the best divisions of the German army. Vatutin's tactical brilliance had turned the battle into a slaughter, with German tanks burning across the battlefield like funeral pyres. Hoth's radio communications with his division commanders became increasingly desperate as one formation after another reported that they were being overwhelmed by Soviet forces. The 4th Panzer Army, once the pride of the German military, was being annihilated before Hoth's eyes. But Vatutin wasn't finished. As German forces began to retreat from Prokhorovka, the Soviet commander launched a series of coordinated attacks all along the front. Fresh Soviet divisions, held in reserve for weeks, poured into the battle with devastating effect. German forces that had survived the initial slaughter at Prokhorovka found themselves under attack from multiple directions as Vatutin's carefully planned counteroffensive unfolded with mechanical precision. The retreat quickly became a rout. As German units, cut off from their supply lines and surrounded by Soviet forces, began to surrender in large numbers. The psychological impact on Hoth was devastating. The man who had mocked Vatutin as weak was now watching his life's work being destroyed by the Soviet commander's tactical genius. German intelligence intercepts from this period reveal Hoth's growing desperation as he pleaded with his superiors for reinforcements that would never come. The Wehrmacht's Eastern Front reserves had been committed to the Kursk offensive and were being systematically destroyed by Vatutin's forces. There would be no miraculous rescue for the 4th Panzer Army. By July 15th, the German offensive had completely collapsed. Hoth's forces were in full retreat, leaving behind thousands of destroyed tanks, vehicles and artillery pieces. The elite SS Panzer divisions that had spearheaded the German attack were reduced to mere shadows of their former strength. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, had lost over 70% of its tanks and was effectively combat ineffective. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, had suffered similar losses and would never again play a significant role in German offensive operations. These were the divisions that Hoth had been most confident would break Soviet resistance, and they had been utterly destroyed by Vatutin's tactical brilliance. The human cost of Hoth's arrogance was staggering. German casualties at Kursk exceeded 200,000 men, with the 4th Panzer Army bearing the brunt of these losses. Entire veteran units that had fought across Europe were wiped out in the killing fields around Kursk. These weren't just numbers on a casualty report, they were the cream of the German military, experienced soldiers who could never be replaced. Many of these men had followed Hoth through the early victories of the war, trusting in his leadership and tactical ability. Now they lay dead or wounded on the Russian steppe, victims of their commander's fatal underestimation of his opponent. Vatutin's victory at Kursk was more than just a tactical triumph. It was a strategic masterstroke that changed the entire course of World War II. By destroying the Wehrmacht's offensive capability on the Eastern Front, Vatutin had ensured that Germany would never again be able to launch a major offensive against the Soviet Union. The initiative had permanently shifted to the Red Army, and from Kursk onward, German forces would be fighting a desperate defensive war against an increasingly powerful Soviet military machine. The irony of Hoth's situation was not lost on other German commanders. The man who had mocked Soviet generals as weak had been comprehensively outmaneuvered by one of the most brilliant military minds of the 20th century. Vatutin's defensive strategy at Kursk became a textbook example of how to defeat a superior enemy through careful planning, patience, and tactical brilliance. Military academies around the world still study Vatutin's Kursk campaign as an example of perfect defensive warfare. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of Hoth's defeat was its impact on German morale. The Wehrmacht had built its reputation on rapid, decisive victories achieved through superior tactics and technology. The disaster at Kursk shattered this myth of German invincibility and demonstrated that the Red Army had evolved into a formidable fighting force capable of outfighting German units on their own terms. German soldiers who had once felt invincible now faced the prospect of fighting an enemy that was not only numerically superior, but tactically superior as well. Hoth's career never recovered from the Kursk disaster. Although he continued to serve in various commands until the end of the war, his reputation was forever tarnished by his catastrophic underestimation of Vatutin. The man who had once been considered one of Germany's most promising panzer commanders became a cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance and racial prejudice in military leadership. His private correspondence from the post-Kursk period reveals a broken man, haunted by the knowledge that his hubris had contributed to one of the most devastating defeats in German military history. Vatutin, tragically, would not live to see the ultimate victory his tactical genius had made possible. In early 1944, while commanding Soviet forces in Ukraine, he was ambushed and killed by Ukrainian nationalist partisans. His death was a tremendous loss for the Red Army, robbing them of one of their most brilliant commanders just as the war was entering its final phase. But Vatutin's legacy lived on in the tactical doctrines he had developed and the officers he had trained. The defensive strategies he pioneered at Kursk would be used throughout the remainder of the war and would influence military thinking for decades to come. The Battle of Kursk also marked a turning point in the technological war between Germany and the Soviet Union. Hoth had placed enormous faith in German technological superiority, particularly the new Tiger and Panther tanks that were supposed to give German forces a decisive advantage. But Vatutin's forces had demonstrated that superior tactics and preparation could overcome technological advantages. Soviet anti-tank guns, carefully positioned and expertly operated, had proven capable of destroying even the most advanced German armor. The myth of German technological invincibility was shattered along with Hoth's panzer divisions. The strategic implications of Vatutin's victory extended far beyond the Eastern Front. The failure of Operation Citadel convinced Hitler that Germany could no longer win a decisive victory against the Soviet Union, leading to a fundamental shift in German strategy toward defensive warfare. Resources that might have been used for further offensives were instead diverted to building fortifications and defensive positions. This strategic shift gave the Allies crucial breathing room to build up their forces for the eventual invasion of Western Europe. From a purely military perspective, the confrontation between Hoth and Vatutin represents one of the most decisive command duels in military history. Two brilliant military minds, representing completely different approaches to warfare, met in a battle that would determine the fate of millions. Hoth's arrogance and racial prejudice blinded him to the true capabilities of his opponent, while Vatutin's careful preparation and tactical brilliance allowed him to achieve one of the most complete victories in military history. The personal tragedy of Hermann Hoth serves as a powerful reminder of how personal prejudices can lead to military disaster. His contempt for Soviet military capabilities was rooted not in careful analysis of enemy strengths and weaknesses, but in racist assumptions about Slavic inferiority that were common among Nazi ideology. This prejudice prevented him from recognizing that the Red Army of 1943 was a completely different force from the disorganized military that had been caught off guard in 1941. By the time of Kursk, the Soviet military had learned from its early defeats and had evolved into a sophisticated fighting force capable of matching German tactical prowess. The aftermath of Kursk also revealed the fundamental flaws in German strategic thinking. The Wehrmacht's emphasis on rapid, decisive victories was poorly suited to the vast expanses and enormous population of the Soviet Union. Vatutin understood that the key to defeating the Germans was not to match them in rapid maneuver warfare, but to force them into prolonged battles of attrition where Soviet numerical superiority could be brought to bear. His defensive strategy at Kursk was specifically designed to negate German tactical advantages and force the Wehrmacht into exactly the kind of prolonged battle that German logistics and manpower could not sustain. The destruction of Hoth's panzer divisions at Kursk also had profound implications for German defensive capabilities in Western Europe. Many of the units destroyed at Kursk had been earmarked for transfer to France to strengthen German defenses against the expected Allied invasion. The loss of these experienced formations meant that when D-Day finally came, German forces in Normandy were largely composed of second-line troops and hastily trained replacements. Vatutin's victory at Kursk had weakened German defenses across all fronts. Perhaps most importantly, the battle demonstrated the evolution of the Red Army from the poorly equipped and badly led force that had suffered catastrophic defeats in 1941 to a modern military machine capable of outfighting the Wehrmacht on equal terms. This transformation was due in large part to commanders like Vatutin, who had learned from early defeats and developed new tactical doctrines specifically designed to counter German advantages. The Red Army that fought at Kursk was disciplined, well-equipped, and expertly led, a far cry from the demoralized force that had retreated in chaos during the early days of Barbarossa. The personal cost of this transformation was enormous. Vatutin himself would pay with his life less than a year after his greatest triumph, and millions of Soviet soldiers had died in the process of learning how to fight the German military machine. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. The victory at Kursk proved that the Wehrmacht could be defeated, and it provided a template for the offensive operations that would eventually carry Soviet forces all the way to Berlin. In the end, the confrontation between Hoth and Vatutin at Kursk stands as one of the defining moments of World War II. Hoth's arrogance and contempt for his opponent led directly to one of the most catastrophic defeats in German military history, while Vatutin's tactical brilliance and careful preparation achieved a victory that changed the entire course of the war. The weak Soviet general that Hoth had mocked had proven to be one of the most formidable military commanders of the 20th century, and his victory at Kursk would echo through history as a testament to the power of preparation, tactical brilliance, and the fatal consequences of underestimating one's enemy.